Well, good morning, everyone. And it's my privilege to introduce our main speaker this morning, Professor Suzanne Mettler of Cornell University. She couldn't make it into California, so she picked Cornell. Her accolades are many. She is the Clinton Rosser Professor of American Institutions. Her book, Degrees of Inequality How Higher Ed Politics Have Sabotaged the American Dream, will be the focus of her talk today, but she has many other books and honors. She wrote The Submerged State How Invisible Government Programs Undermine American Democracy, Dividing Citizens, Gender and Federalism in New Deal Public Policy. That received both the Kemmerer Award from the American Political Science Association and the Martha Derrick Award. Also, Soldiers to Citizens, the GI Bill, and the Making of the Greatest Generation. That would be my family. As well as a slew of articles in prestigious journals and op ed pieces in the New York Times and the LA Times. Last night, we heard from Kevin Finneran, who presented data about the identified source for many of the American dream was higher education. That was supposed to then lead to well paying jobs and security for the next generation. Several questions, a number of them by our students, were posed to him that begged for further and richer data analysis. So I ran a data table last night for first generation women. I let one token male be at my table, and I asked them how they paid for their education. None of the first generation parents paid for their education. They got their education by working, by scholarships, and by loans. Very few loans. I believe that today you're going to hear a very challenging presentation about what is a very changed scenario for our students, for our children, and our grandchildren. I am hoping that knowledge is power and that you will leave empowered to work on solutions for these very critical issues that are facing all of us in higher education. So I give you Suzanne Mettler.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you to Chancellor White and to Academic Senate Chair Diana Gurin and to Susan Gubernat for inviting me here. I'm just really thrilled and honored to be here with all of you today. Um, if you think of, people tell me that when they read my book that it's depressing, which I'm sorry to say, I don't like to, be depressing in the message I deliver. But if I think of where is the hope and where is the direction for the future, it's in what you're doing here in the California State University system. Here you are graduating more undergraduates with bachelor's degrees than any other system in the country and graduating a very, very highly diverse class year after year, providing high quality, accessible education. So I'm really honored to be with you. I hope that what I'm offering to you can be of use to you. I'm a political scientist. I didn't start out as a scholar of higher education. I'm someone who studies all sorts of American public policies, social welfare policies, policies in the tax code, and higher education policies, looking at how their politics develops and how they came to be and what their effects are once they're established and so on. And so I'm going to be giving a talk that's a summary of my book here, Degrees of Inequality. And it's very much a wide-ranging story that's very historical and goes across federal and state levels. I think that for many of you in the room, a lot of what I'm talking about will be very familiar to you. But I hope that the big picture that I'm laying out as a political scientist through the kind of analytical lenses that I use can be helpful in some way to the discussions that you are having. So I want to begin by actually going back to tell you a little bit about one of my previous books, my book about the GI Bill. that I did research for actually in the late 1990s when we still had many members of the World War II generation among us. And this particular man, Richard Colosimo, I interviewed him here in California in about 1999. And he was at that time in his mid 70s. But here he is graduating from college on the GI Bill as a young man. He had grown up during the Great Depression very poor and remembers being hungry a lot. And he really had no hope of going on for further education beyond high school. But he does remember that his father always said to him, Dick, if you have any opportunity to do it, get an education. Well, World War II came along and he served in the 89th Infantry Division in Europe. And toward the end of the war, his division was liberating concentration camps. He came back home and suddenly learned about this new public policy, the GI Bill, that had been created for World War II veterans to enable them to get vocational training or college education at government expense. So he said to himself, and I'll always remember him saying this to me, television is the coming thing. I'll become a TV repairman. So the first thing he did was that he was living in Chicago and he went to a vocational training program and learned how to do that. And he discovered along the way that he liked being a student and he was good at it. So he decided, because he had more GI Bill eligibility left, to apply for college. Well, the long story short is that he ends up getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, became an engineer. He enjoyed a standard of living that he never could have dreamed of in childhood. And like so many other veterans who I interviewed for that project, he talked about the value of learning and how it opened the world to him. Um, I also interviewed for that project Henry Hervey, the man on the right, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was someone who was very committed to getting more education if he could. And he said he probably would have gone to night school or something like that. But instead, because of his GI Bill eligibility, he applied to Northwestern University, got his 4-year degree there, became an accountant, and then really became, like so many other Black veterans I discovered, a part of the leadership of the civil rights movement, of people who had really acquired these skills and networks through the education process and really became a force in making the United States more democratic. Well, the GI Bill was just the first of many public policies that we created as a nation in the middle of the 20th century. Soon thereafter, we extended student aid to civilian students through the National Defense Education Act, and then signed into law by President Eisenhower. And then Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Higher Education Act in 1965. Then in 1972, there were the amendments to that created the Pell Grants for low-income students, still in existence today. And throughout that same period in time, the states began to invest more than ever. And of course, you here in California were right at the front lines of that with the master plan that really established this system. And so here is this really amazing statistic. I'll try not to give you too many statistics, but this one is really startling to me. If you look at the eve of World War II, 1940, 1 in 20 young Americans aged 25 to 35 had a 4-year college degree, 1 in 20. By 1977, it's 1 in 4. That's just a phenomenal change in a relatively short period in time. And that's when we were, as a country, truly investing in higher education. And the national level and state level were working together to do so. And education became thought of during that period in time as the path to the American dream, as a source of upward mobility, and more and more people were taking advantage of it. So the question is, what's happened since that time? Once I finished this book on the GI Bill, I really wanted to understand what was happening today. Here we are since the 1970s in this period of rising economic inequality in the United States. So I wanted to know, is higher education still serving that function of giving people a chance for opportunity? And so I began studying this about 8 years ago. It took me a while. Each of my books, for the most part, seems to go that way. And to cut to the chase, what I've come to is that today our system of higher education, while very much still in place, is instead of functioning as well to provide opportunity, it's separating into very stratified and unequal tiers that take students from different places in the socioeconomic spectrum and all too often leave them even more separated from each other than when they began. Now, I don't mean to say that it works this way for everyone, and certainly for many students, and I believe in your system, there are many students who acquire great opportunities still today through being able to go to college. But overall, as I step back and I look at the whole system of higher education in the United States, I'm afraid that it's functioning somewhat as a caste system, which is reinforcing inequality rather than mitigating it. So the question is, why has that occurred? And what I'm going to be arguing to you is that this is a failure of public policy and fundamentally a political failure. So first, let me talk about some of the big trends of what's changed over this period in time. First of all, the United States was just a few decades ago, the international leader in terms of the percentage of our young people who had college degrees. But now about 10 other countries have leapfrogged over us. What this chart is showing you, if you look at the United States here over on the left, the square shows you people in the cohort group who are my older siblings, people in their later 50s and early 60s, who of their cohort group around the world were the most highly educated, most likely to have college degrees. And yet, when you look at young adults, ages 25 to 34, we've had just a couple of percentage points increase since that time, whereas all of these other countries have leapfrogged over us. Now, if you look at who's getting a college degree in the United States today, what you find is that, in fact, it's exacerbating economic inequality. Today, we have more students than ever who start college. When you look at who's starting college, the numbers look really great. We have more people than ever finishing high school and more than ever who go on to college. And yet, when you look at the graduation rates within 6 years later, there's a different story there. So starting college, you have more and more people from across the income spectrum. But when you look at the college graduation rates by age 24, in fact, at the top, it looks great. There are these big increases where now, for people who grow up in the top quarter of the income spectrum, going to college is just like getting vaccinated. Almost everybody does it. It's widespread, and 71% graduate by age 24. And so that's 2011, and compared to 1970 when it was 40%. But if you look at everyone else in the bottom 75% of the income spectrum, the gains are unimpressive, I think. And in the bottom quartile, still only 1 in 10 young people by age 24 has a 4-year college degree, and only 15% of those in the second quartile. Now, there's a lot of numbers here, and I'm not going to get into all the details, though some of them will come out across my talk. What's important today is not just whether or not a young person enrolls in college, but what college they attend, because it turns out that there are very different experiences for students depending upon the particular sector of higher education they attend and the particular institution that they attend, in terms of how much they'll actually have to pay, what the sticker price is, and what the actual amount they pay is, how much they'll need to borrow in student loans to attend, what their educational experience will be like in the classroom, to what extent will they deal with professors versus online courses, how large will those classes be, and their likelihood of graduating, and then their default rate on student loans. And we find it's very different across the board. And my concern when I step back from all of this is that we're creating these tiers where private nonprofits, which of course are the most expensive, are increasingly becoming an echelon where, outside of the top few that are that are very well endowed and provide some real need-based aid, that many of those schools are in a race to try to do better in U.S. News and World Report, and they are giving their resources to students who get merit aid, and so they're increasingly schools that are benefiting people who come from very affluent families. And then 73% of American college students, most students, attend public universities like the California state system. And then I will talk about the challenges at the public level. And low to middle income students are very much accommodated by, but increasingly challenged by, trends in this sector. And then we have a growing number of students who are the first in their families to go to college, who are going to the for-profit colleges, but where the outcomes are really poor in terms of graduation rates and student loan debt. So more about that in a few moments. So if you add all of this up, it seems that increasingly higher education is functioning as a caste system that's exacerbating inequality rather than lessening it in American society today. So why has this occurred? This is the main question of my book. Well, first of all, while I was working on this book, my mother would often say to me, Suzanne, this is simply about the tuition. Tuition has gone way up. And many people would tell me this while I was working on this book. And of course, that's undeniable. Tuition has gone up at all sorts of institutions in all sectors much faster than inflation. But what I would do as a political scientist is to put this in perspective. If you look throughout American history, from the Northwest Ordinance onward, soon after the American founding, the US government, both the federal level and the states, have always subsidized higher education in some way because we've seen it as a public good that's really important for American society. And so by subsidizing it, we've lowered what students themselves actually pay to attend. So the question is, to what extent are we doing that today compared to the past? The photos here, I'm showing you Abraham Lincoln because in 1862, he signed into law the Morrill Act, creating the land grant institutions. And there's Congressman Morrill to the right who authored that law. Now, another argument that people will make is it's all about aptitude. People will say, well, we are letting more students than ever attend college today from across the income spectrum, and many of these students are simply not prepared to be there. So it's no surprise that the graduation rates are not so high. And here, what I would say is that from all of the research I've done from existing work, a lot of it's been done by economists and others, what it shows is that the predominant reason why students once enrolled drop out of college has to do with expenses. They can't afford the tuition. And then the second most important reason, which is I think really a replication of the first, is that they are working so many hours on the side to try to afford tuition that they can't keep up with their studies. What this graph is showing is that if you look at people's test scores on a standardized math test in high school, and then whether several years later those individuals had graduated from college, what you see is that people who grew up low income but had high test scores, that's the green bar that says 30%, they were just about as likely to be able to finish college as those who grew up high income but had low test scores. So it certainly seems here that resources are playing a major role in what's going on. So I began this whole project, and I have many different kinds of research that I did that I pulled together into this book. It's a multi-method sort of project. I did a considerable analysis of government documents and the historical record from across time. I interviewed many policymakers in Washington, D.C., people on Capitol Hill, staffers, members of Congress, people in the Department of Education in Washington, as well as people who work in various of the trade associations that lobby on higher education and the student associations and so on. And then I put together a large database about the states, and so that I could try to analyze which states were were investing more in higher education over time and what the determinants of that were, and so on. So I pull all of this together into this book. So now let me cut to the chase again and give you my main analytical argument. And here you have to, bear with me. You might feel like you're back in the classroom, but I am a political scientist. And what I tend to do in my work is to develop a concept that I feel is helpful for illuminating what's going on. So the concept that I came up with as I worked on this book over time was the policy scape. Not just in higher education policy, but in many different areas today. We have existing policies that were created in the past, often through the middle of the 20th century, but some earlier, some later. And they continue to be in place today. They're on the books. We're spending money on them. But they're not necessarily functioning the way they were set up to function or as well as they functioned in the past to achieve their goals. Because public policies, just like anything, need maintenance. I think of, metaphors for this. If you've ever lived in an old house, as I do, you know that things need maintenance all the time, or they can go off the rails. Or if you've ever planted a perennial garden. I remember the first time I planted a perennial garden, I thought, well, this will be great because I'll just plant the plants and then it will just carry on year after year. Then you find after a few years that living where I do in upstate New York, that, the cold winters has killed off some of the plants. Others become like invasive species and take over. So maintenance is necessary, and it's necessary in public policy just like anything else. And if maintenance does not occur, things go off the rails. The picture here is former Senator Nancy Kassebaum, who is a moderate Republican from Kansas. And she, for a period of time, the 1980s and 1990s, she was either the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee in the Senate or the ranking member. Often she and Ted Kennedy were working together, and they worked quite effectively together. And she, even though they had different points of view, and she said to me, public programs, like any programs, need to be managed, but she feels that's not happening effectively today. If policies are not managed, you can have any of at least three effects that happen over time that take things off the rails. You can have policy design effects, where some policies become more easily sustainable and others atrophy. And I will explain to you how student loans have been remarkably sustainable, and they've grown over time, while Pell Grants have atrophied. Policies can have unintended consequences. They can create an incentive for some industry to make profits off of government, and then to increasingly lobby and get things in a policy going in a direction that helps them more than the general public, in this case, students. And that had happened for a long time around bank-based student lending, and I believe today around the for-profit colleges. And then another problem is what I call lateral effects, and that's what's really happening here at the state level, where other kinds of funding are for other policies is competing with funding for higher education policy. Now, all of this policies going off the rails does not have to be inevitable, because after all, we have lawmakers. They should be able to take this on as a major task of governance to update and maintain policies. However, and here's the key insight of the book, the extent to which policy maintenance occurs depends on the political context. What I found is that as recently as the 1980s and early 1990s, we were effectively managing at the national level to maintain public policies. But from about the mid-90s to the present, it has not been happening. It has not been functioning well in the realm of higher ed policy. And that's because of two major characteristics of our contemporary political system. The first one is polarization. Partisan polarization today is greater in Washington, D.C. than it's been at any point for at least 100 years. And that's made it extremely difficult to come together on higher ed policy, an area that historically was much more bipartisan than many other issue areas. And that explains a lot of the stalemate around policy issues. But there's another dynamic that is there coexisting with polarization, and that is that amidst this stalemate, there are some interests that still manage to have their voices heard in politics above the din. And they tend to be powerful vested interests that make a profit off of the unintended consequences of public policies. And they manage to have their voices heard. And I call that dynamic plutocracy. So the twin pairing of polarization and plutocracy has been really problematic for maintaining and updating our public policies. Now, I'm going to illustrate this across three aspects of higher ed policy. The first is federal student aid. Now, here you have Lyndon Johnson back in 1965 signing into law the Higher Education Act. He went back to his alma mater, a Southwest Texas State College, and signed this into law. There's Lady Bird Johnson behind him. And so this policy, at the outset, it was being reauthorized every few years and updated and maintained quite effectively. Today, we are actually spending more than ever for the Higher Ed Act and for student aid generally at the federal level, and yet not very effectively or equitably. So, what happened? Well, what this graph is showing you is, first of all, if you look at the dotted line, that's the cost of tuition in real terms, adjusted for inflation, across time at the average four-year public university. And so tuition has indeed, as my mother said, gone up quite a bit. And meanwhile, Pell Grant levels, which are the green line, really stagnated for a long time and fell behind their value in the 1970s when they were first created. In the 1970s, a student on a Pell Grant at the average four-year public university was able to cover about 80% of the cost of tuition, fees, room, and board. Today, it covers about 31% for the average four-year public university. Now, and that's despite recent increases. As you can see over to the right, just in the last few years, the federal government, since around 2007, has really increased Pell Grants quite a bit. And yet it's still, it's around the value that it had, or a little above the value that it had in the 1970s, but well behind the cost of tuition. So what happened in the meanwhile is that it was really hard for lawmakers in the 1980s when we had divided government after years of having one party in control of Congress. It was really hard for them to come together to agree to increase Pell Grant levels. Here's a policy design effect. Pell Grants are not like Social Security. Social Security, because of Richard Nixon signing into law cost of living adjustments, they go up annually with the cost of inflation. Pell Grant levels do not. Instead, they require lawmakers in Congress to come together in these really contentious budget battles year after year. Otherwise, they fall behind. And that's what happened during the 1980s and into the 1990s. It became much easier for lawmakers to take the path of least resistance and around student loans to say, let's just allow more students to borrow more money. And that's what happened, is that the average student started, as tuition went up, started borrowing more and more and getting less in grant aid over that period of time. And so student loans, again, because of policy design effects, easily grow and mushroom. So what were the political dynamics behind this? Now, this is a complex sort of graph, so let me tell you what's going on here. The green and red line show you the increasing partisan polarization in the House and the Senate. I'm using a score that political scientists use. They're called DW Nominate scores, and they measure the gap on all votes, on all issues, between the average Democrat and the average Republican in Congress. So as you can see, in the middle of the 20th century, when we were creating these big landmark laws, the GI Bill, National Defense Education Act, Higher Ed Act, and Pell Grants, which I have shown over here on the left, we had relatively low levels of partisan polarization, which suggests to me it was much easier in that environment to be able to create landmark laws, and we haven't created more of them in recent decades. Now, what the gray vertical bars are showing you is the gap between Democrats and Republicans in support for those particular major bills, higher ed acts. And as you can see, the gap was quite low for these major landmark laws. What the bars on the right are showing is simply votes on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. You might think that these would not be so contentious, and yet they've become very contentious over time. Another way of looking at how problematic polarization has been for policymaking around federal student aid is to dig deeper into these reauthorizations of the Higher Ed Act. I looked at votes on amendments to these reauthorizations and at the partisan gap in support, and found that that gap has been growing over time in both the House and the Senate from just 1971 to 2008. So here again, polarization makes higher education lawmaking all the more difficult. Now, it's not that we haven't done anything new in federal student aid over this period in time. The big new game in town since the late 1990s has been spending through the tax code, or allowing people to pay less in taxes in relation to what they've paid in tuition. Now, this is an interesting story. I found when I went way back to 1965 and looked at the creation of the Higher Education Act that Republicans were saying we would rather do federal student aid through the tax code. And the Democrats were unwilling to go along with that. And this same sort of battle was played out again and again over the next few decades until 1996, when Bill Clinton was running for re-election against Bob Dole. And Dick Morris, who was his pollster in the White House, discovered that in polls, if Americans were asked, would they like to have tuition tax breaks, people said, yes, absolutely, we would love that. And so Dick Morris said to Bill Clinton, you should run on this. It's a great campaign issue. And all of Clinton's advisors in the White House said, bad idea. It's not a good idea, not a good use of federal resources, and it's not going to expand access to education. But in fact, Morris won the day. Clinton campaigned on it, and then after getting reelected, signed into law the Hope and Lifetime Learning tax credits. Now, they were targeted predominantly to lower middle income students, but they've been that same sort of policy design has been replicated by the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, and now these sorts of policies help students that go pretty high up the income spectrum. Obama's major policy, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, the largest share of it goes to students from families who are just below the income cap of $180,000 a year. And so as a result, we are losing in federal revenues a lot of resources, about $16.7 billion, that could be used in ways that would be more effective for expanding access to college and really expanding college graduation rates. Because the way these benefits are delivered, it's long after tuition is paid. So it doesn't actually change who applies for college and their ability to go. Now, if we turn to public universities and colleges, so obviously this is the issue that all of you are thinking about the most, and here you'll see how it kind of fits into my broader analysis. I think of this as the elephant in the room, the big story, because 73% of American college students attend this sector, that state spending has declined precipitously since the early 1990s. Now, it was interesting. During the 1980s, we were, at the federal level, we began to spend less on Pell Grants and so on, but states continued to invest a great deal into the early 1990s, and then states declined as well. So state spending per student in real terms on average across the nation declined by 26% from 1990 to 2010. And so universities and colleges, in order to pay their bills in a time when their bills were going up, education was becoming more expensive, then increased tuition by about 113% on average in real terms. And meanwhile, graduation rates have declined in the public sector nationwide. Economists who have studied this have found that what universities and colleges have done in order to make do with less in resources is they've used more adjuncts, they've moved more to online teaching, they've put more students in the classroom, and all of these things hurt graduation rates among less affluent students. And so there seems to be a really problematic relationship there. This graph is showing you as a percentage of family income, 1971 compared to 2011, the cost, this sticker price of attending the public, the average four-year public institution by quintiles, income quintiles. And as you can see, even back in 1971, for someone in the lowest quintile to pay 42% of their family income was going to be difficult, but they were going to have a generous Pell Grant at that point. But now it's up to 114%. And so that's absolutely, prohibitive. And really, in doing the math, I found, these levels are prohibitive for all except the most affluent students. So why is this happening? Well, here are the lateral effects at work. What's happened here is that the big story is that costs for other public policies have grown over time in real terms, and they've been squeezing out higher education. So you can see here the blue line is cost for K-12 education on a per capita basis. Costs for Medicaid is the yellow line, and prisons is the purple line. From the scale, you can't quite tell that the purple line is going up, but it actually goes up quite a bit. Whereas spending on higher ed has been flat now for a few decades. And what's happened is that those other types of spending are all what we call mandatory spending. If you have more people who are sent to prison, you have to come up with the cost. You have more students who are going to go through the schools, K-12 schools, you've got to spend more. Whereas higher ed is the largest discretionary item in state budgets. And so state legislatures have had to turn to that to make cuts. The other part of the story here is that tax revenues, while they've been going up over time, that's the green line, have been flat over the past decade. And I found when I looked at this nationwide that since the 1970s, about half of the states have adopted policies that have made it extremely difficult for them to raise revenues or to make changes in how they currently raise revenues. I think this is really problematic because we've had rising economic inequality since that time. So we're using these old tax systems that really don't account for those changes. Now, I am not going to try to imitate the voice of your former governor, but I was very struck by this quote I came across from an address of his in 2010, where he says, "The priorities have become out of whack over the years. I mean, think about it. 30 years ago, 10% of the general fund went to higher education and 3% went to prisons. Today, almost 11% goes to prisons and only 7.5% goes to higher ed. What does it say about any state that focuses more on prison uniforms than on caps and gowns? It simply is not healthy." So, that it's a quote that highlights this trade-off of the lateral effects that have been faced at the public level. And then the third and final policy area that I'm going to talk about is the rise of the for-profit colleges. Now, you might be looking at the pictures of all these people together on one slide and imagining what could they possibly have in common and what could bring them together. Well, it turns out that even in this era of high partisan polarization, all of these members of the House of Representatives have been brought together on a few occasions for votes in support of the for-profit colleges, the most rapidly increasing sector of higher education. Now, as recently, and I have to say, when I started working on this book, people would say to me, "Well, are you going to study the for-profits?" And, I thought, well, how important can they be? And I kept saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And then eventually I realized I really had to. As recently as the early 1990s, the for-profits enrolled only about 1.6% of all college students. But today, they're somewhere up between around 10 to 13%, maybe down a little bit from the last couple of years as they've been under some pressure, but still they've grown rapidly. And they are defended by both Democrats and Republicans, which is really interesting in an era of high partisan polarization. As a political scientist, I found this really intriguing. So Democrats will support them, and actually, Democrats long supported them. Let me actually back up for a moment. It turns out that when the first GI Bill was created in after World War or during World War II, that students would use it predominantly for vocational training, and that led to the growth of all of these new schools, which were in fact the precursors to the for-profits. They were at the time called trade schools, and then over time proprietary schools and so on. And actually, while the GI Bill was being implemented, they caused a lot of problems. And Congress convened, Democrats and Republicans together were concerned about the waste of federal funds and regulated it more seriously, particularly as they went into the Korean War GI Bill, so that that would not occur. But the problem, had been emerging over time in veterans benefits. And then as soon as we turned to allowing from the early 1970s on, allowing the for-profits to use civilian student aid, student loans and Pell Grants for for-profits, then problems started emerging there. But Democrats were long their defenders. And that's in part because you had people like Bill Ford serving as the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, and he himself had been a beneficiary of these schools as a veteran after World War II. And he truly believed that they were providing access to less advantaged Americans, which they had in many ways and in the past, but with a very mixed record. And the record became more mixed over time. If you look today at who attends them, they are the sector of higher education over there to the right, which is majority minority in terms of their student body. And they tend to recruit students who are first in their family to go to college, and one of the first often in their community to go to college. And yet, the problem is, I would say, that the record is really poor. Their graduation rates are hard to pin down, but they seem to be about 22% these days. Nearly all of their students borrow to attend, about 94% of those who are pursuing bachelor's degrees. And those who finish have borrowed $33,000 as a median student debt load, higher than in any other sector of higher education. However, for too many of those students, they find that the employment that they are able to get afterwards does not enable them to repay the heavy debt load that they've taken on. And so they have a very high default rate of 23% within 3 years. So the Democrats argue they're promoting opportunity. To me, this does not look very convincing. Republicans make a different argument to defend the for-profits. And this is one that they've been making only more recently, since the late 1990s. For the Republicans today, they think of the for-profit sector as the private sector in action in higher education, and a sector they would like to endorse as being more entrepreneurial. And yet, it's hard. Well, if you look at it, the top 14 or so of these institutions are now publicly traded on Wall Street, and their shareholders have made substantial profits off of this industry. And yet, I don't find this credible either. Now, I know I've been talking for a long time, but the next thing, if you haven't already heard this is where you really need to listen up. I was last spring, after my book came out, I was traveling somewhere to give a talk on the book, and because it was new for me to give these talks, I was trying to brush up on the details. So I'm sitting on the plane reading my book. So this man next to me, friendly fellow, says, "What are you reading?" And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how do I answer this question? I said, well, it's actually a book I wrote. At this point, I'm thinking my seatmate is very nervous. He's thinking to himself, if she did actually write this book, why is she rereading it? But he was very inquisitive and kept asking me all sorts of questions about the book, the argument, and so on, and helped get me ready for this talk I was going to give. And but we were on a kind of a bumpy flight. And it's when I told him the next thing that I'm going to tell you that he nearly fell out of his chair. And he said, You've got to tell your audience that first. So here I am finally late in this talk giving you this detail. Um, the for-profit colleges are permitted by law to receive up to 90% of their revenues from the federal government. And actually from just one public policy, and that's the Higher Education Act Title IV, the student loans and Pell Grants and so on. It doesn't count what they're able to get above and beyond that from the post 9/11 GI Bill and other military related education programs. So if you look over here on the right, you'll see the Apollo Group, for example, that owns the University of Phoenix, receiving 89% of its revenues from government. The Education Management Corporation, which owns a lot of separate colleges like art institutes and the like, 80% of its revenues from government, and so on. Today, these schools use 1 in 4 federal student aid dollars, and they account for nearly half of all student loan defaults. So when I look at this, it doesn't look to me like the private sector either. So how has this emerged? And here's this really interesting political story that I uncovered in looking at this. As I was mentioning to you, it's not new for there to be problems surrounding the for-profit colleges. These are unintended consequences like can happen in any public policy area. But in the past, Democrats and Republicans would come together to try to regulate the use of government funds in this area. And that happened as recently as the early 1990s. During the 1980s, most all Republicans in Washington thought that the for-profit colleges were a big problem. And here's William Bennett up here on the left, Secretary of Education for Ronald Reagan. And I want to quote to you what he said. He called the for-profits, quote, diploma mills designed to trick the poor into taking on federally backed debt, milk them for their loan money, and then wash them out or, quote unquote, graduate them, ill-prepared to enter the job market and pay off their loans. What's striking to me about that quote is that today in Washington, it would be difficult to find a single Republican who would endorse that view, because instead the party has very much lined up in support of the industry. And that's so different from when Bob Dole in 1990 and Phil Gramm were endorsing regulations to try to rein in the industry's use of federal funds. Sam Nunn, a moderate Democrat, from Georgia, ran all of these hearings in the Senate looking at abuses by the for-profit sector. And then Maxine Waters from right here in Los Angeles came to Congress saying, my constituents have been hurt by these colleges and we need to regulate them. And so she and being a liberal Democrat, worked together with moderate Republicans and some more conservative Democrats in 1992, and they created some regulations. However, over the next 15 years or so, those regulations were taken apart piece by piece. And that's really where things are at in terms of existing law right now. Now, the Obama administration decided that they would instead try to work through the administrative state, through the Department of Education. So they've created the gainful employment rules in Obama's first term, very contentious, very watered down set of rules finally emerged. And then they were thrown out by a judge. Now there's been a whole new set that's been devised through another contentious process. And again, they will be fought in court, and we will see what becomes of that. So, to conclude, I am concerned today that we are squandering one of the United States' finest accomplishments and historic legacies, a system of higher education that was long characterized by excellence and wide accessibility to what seemed to be an ever wider and more diverse group of citizens. As a result of these trends, we are producing too few highly educated workers to provide the innovation and creativity the economy requires. Our international competitiveness is fading. The ranks of those who participate intensely in the political process is growing more unequal. And the American dream and the opportunity to learn is increasingly out of reach for too many citizens. But From the Northwest Ordinance through the Morrill Act and up through the creation of Pell Grants in 1972, the United States found ways to promote broad public purposes through innovative higher education policies. And I believe that we can find ways to do that again in our own time, and that we must. Thank you.
Wow. I've been given a lot to think about and had my views validated all at the same time. Thank you, Dr. Mettler.